you come in and you think, oh, well, I've got an agent now. That's hard part's over and done with. 100% not. Like, the hard part comes when you're trying to compete with other fantastic books, all of which have already got over that first hurdle.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Conversation with your host, Nadine Matheson. As always, I hope that you're well and I hope that you've had a good week. Also, you're going to have to excuse me because I have a bit of a cold. So I'm not going to do my usual longer intro where I talk about whatever subject has just popped into my head at the moment. But what I will say is this. Right now, it seems as if every day we wake up to some kind of nonsense. So I'm going to encourage you to please take refuge in books. Buy all the books, read all the books, support your independent bookshops. You need to distract yourself from whatever's going on sometimes, and books are the best refuge. Now, let's get on with the show. This week, I'm in conversation with author David Goodman, whose debut novel, A Reluctant Spy, is out now. And don't forget, the links to buy his book and the books of all of my guests on this podcast are available in the show notes. And in the show notes, you'll also find a link to my book list on bookshop.org. And the list for the Conversation with Nadine Matheson podcast contains all the books from all of my guests who have appeared on this podcast. And the best thing about bookshop.org is that you will always be supporting independent bookshops. So head to the links in the show notes to purchase Dave Goodman's book, pre-order the paperback, and buy all of the books, any book you fancy. And also, please don't forget to support this podcast by buying me a cup of coffee, or at this rate, a cup of Lemsip on My Coffee, or is it Ko-fi? I'm not sure right now. Again, the link is in the show notes. Right, let's get back to Dave Goodman. In our conversation, Dave Goodman and I talk about his answer to the question, are you a spy? How telling people that you're writing a book is actually a form of procrastination, and the dangers of writing to trend. And also we talk about the evolution of a writer. Now, as always, sit back, we'll go for a walk and enjoy the conversation. Dave Goodman, welcome to The Conversation.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Right. My first question for you is that you write a spy, espionage, contemporary thriller. So I was thinking, how much research do you do into this spy thriller? And I'm not asking if you're a spy, because that would just be like, you wouldn't even tell me anyway.
Yeah, a lot of people do ask me that, to be fair. The disappointing answer that I give to this question, because I get this question quite a lot. The two questions I get are, how do you know about this stuff? And how did you research it? And are you a spy? And the answer to the first question is I mostly make it up. And the answer to the second question is no, I'm definitely not a spy. And I have a legal document, which is the contract that I signed with Headline, my publisher. They have a special clause that they only put into contracts when the person has written something that involves the military or spy stuff, that basically says we don't need to get this book checked with the Ministry of Defence or the government. And if you sign that clause, you're essentially saying this is all made up. And that's very definitely the case, because I signed on the line and said, I made this up entirely.
Really? That's what your contract specifically has, that clause?
Yeah, and it's not in everyone's contracts. They only add it when there's sort of that legal grey area where somebody might have some sort of history that they're using in their fiction.
Obviously the lawyer side of me is just like fascinated by that, because mentally I'm going over my contract in my head and I'm like, I don't think I have anything even similar to that.
No.
Remotely,
I've checked with some friends of mine who have contracts with the same publisher, and they've said, no, I don't have that clause. So legally speaking, I'm definitely not a spy. But the more I say that, the more people are like, no, I don't believe you. Although I did get a review about just before Christmas from the what's called the Studies in Intelligence Journal, which is an in-house journal of the CIA. And this happened just before Christmas, and because I have Google alerts for my book and my name and everything, and I saw like a CIA URL in my Google alerts. I was like, what is that? And I clicked through, and it's a public journal that they distribute for free, and they have a thing in there called the Intelligence Officers Bookshelf, and it's their it's their fiction. Most of it's kind of dry academic stuff about intelligence and so on, but they have like a fiction section. And they were like, oh yeah, this book is obviously not realistic in the slightest, but it's a very solid piece of entertainment. And I was like, brilliant! I'm getting that on a T-shirt. This is amazing.
You need to get it on a T-shirt. You need to get it as well. It's not a testimonial, but you need to have it somewhere within your your paperback editions of the book. But it's like the more you talk about it, the more you protest, the more I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at you like a client now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, sure okay. Are you sure? I'm like, okay, I will follow your instructions. But personally, I'm thinking, I'm not too sure.
It is interesting because I think there's a long history of people who have had a brush with intelligence sort of making nod and a wink references to it and saying, oh yes, well, of course I was approached when I was at Cambridge, etc. And I think that like that's just not happened to me. I will confess there was one very brief period, and we'll probably talk about this later, but at one point I was thinking about joining the army, and right before I moved to London to start a graduate job, I had one interview with the Army's Intelligence Corps, a TA unit up in Scotland. And they, I was on the point of kind of starting the recruitment process with them, but then I got a job and I moved away, so I just never followed through on it. But that's the only time I've ever been anywhere near actual intelligence work, and it was one interview and a cup of tea. So definitely not a spy.
My closest was I applied to MI5's graduate scheme after uni.
I remember hearing you say that in one of your interviews, yeah.
And when I think about it now, I remember the reason why I applied, I think I saw an Evening Standard back then. And I think back then, Evening Standard, it used to be free. So you get your free copy of the Evening Standard. And they always had their job section on a Thursday. And in the Thursday, in the back of it, they had, join MI5. And I think it was the first time they started, and this is like late 90s, the first time they started actively, openly recruiting. And me being me was like, oh all right, I will.
Go. Why not?
I'll give it a go and see what happens. So Dave, how would you describe your writing journey? So I always say your writing journey and your publishing journey are two completely different things.
Both very long and very short is probably the answer to that. And I think I've been writing since I was very young, probably very, very early high school. I was writing stories when I was a kid, telling stories around the campfire and seeing, oh, this is a thing I can do that gets a good reaction from people. So obviously you do more of it. Then I had a couple of supportive teachers in high school, and then a very supportive professor at university when I was there. And I was writing that whole time. But I never really tried to get published. So my first novel, I think I wrote when I was 23, 24, which would have been 2005 period. I did NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. And I wrote a science fiction novel that was terrible. It was really, really bad. And the NaNoWriMo, you have to write 50,000 words in a month, which is about just under 1,700 words a day. So, which is quite a lot. And at the time, I was doing this graduate job, and I was living in hotels in the middle of rural Berkshire, and it was kind of quite miserable. I was doing long days and then coming back to the hotel and writing in the evenings. But it did show me that I could finish a book. But then I took this book and I went out, and because it was 2005, there was really not a lot of information out there about how to query a book, how to find an agent, how the publishing process worked. So I sent it to the 2 or 3 agents that I could find in the Writers and Artists Yearbook, if you remember that big thick book with all the. I think they still publish it, but it's kind of been superseded by the internet. And at the same time, I was writing short stories and sending them mostly to American magazines, and you had to actually post it to them and then wait for them to send the rejection slip back, which took 6 weeks. And I did that, and I got some very nice replies, probably nicer than I deserved, given that I didn't really know what I was doing. They just said no, thank you, not really interested in this. So I kind of just stopped doing that and then just wrote books for 10, 15 years until 2018, 2019. And in that intervening time, I'd been doing kind of very demanding day jobs. I'd worked in marketing mostly, and I was working for agencies. I was doing long hours for not much pay, and it was not great. And then 2017, 2018, I said I'm gonna find a job that's a better work-life balance, and I'm gonna try and focus on this writing thing, because it'd been in the background the whole time. So it was only really 2019, 2020 that I started figuring out like a regular writing process and started to produce stuff systematically. And then I thought, right, I need to kind of get off the fence here and give it a proper go. So I learned to edit, because I had a lot of unedited novels that I hadn't really gone back and done anything with. I just produced the first draft and then threw it over my shoulder and kept going. And I took this book and I said, I'm going to use this as my test project. I'm going to just learn to edit with this book. And then I edited it and I tried out lots of different ways to edit, and I figured out a process that worked for me. And I read it back and I went, actually, I think this is all right. Maybe I could try querying it. And I queried it, sent it out to about 56 agents in the end over the course of 2 or 3 months.
56?
Yeah, I was going quite quickly. I was like sending out sort of 4 or 5 a week for a while. And I got a couple of nibbles, a couple of full requests. But then my current agent, Harry Illingworth, who's the same agent as Tom Hindle that you had on the other day, actually, he came back to me and said, can you send me the full book? And I sort of went, oh, this is very exciting. But really. And I guess I'd done a bunch of research, but I didn't realize at the time how good of a fit Harry was going to be for me as an agent, because he's very much focused on thrillers, which is half of what I write, but also science fiction and fantasy, which is the other half of what I write. So I was like, kind of got quite lucky, really. And he read it really quickly, and he came back and he said, can we have a chat? And we got on the phone, and he offered to represent me. And in that same week, I also sold a short story for the first time. So I had this very, very good week in early 2021 where just my career just appeared overnight like mushrooms after rain. But it was kind of coming on the back of 20 years of just typing on my own in a room and not really interacting with the writing community or publishing at all. So it's been very long, but also very short. It's only been 4 or 5 years since I've been in that world.
This is the thing, though. People will see your book on the shelf, and there's always an assumption, which you can't blame them, that it's happened overnight. But the truth is, it hasn't happened overnight. There has been those long, long days and long nights when it's just you staring at your screen, thinking, "What the hell is this? Why am I doing this? This doesn't make no sense."
It's been interesting as well, though, because the one thing that people would probably say they remembered about me if they worked with me, or if they went to uni with me, or if they'd encountered me in some other context, was, oh yeah, that guy, he talks about writing all the time. You know, his writing is kind of his thing. And I think I kind of got tired of meeting people that I hadn't seen for a little while, and they were like, how's the writing going? And then they do the little head tilt, like, how's the writing going? And I would just and I would just feel this, like, just my heart would sink a little bit, and I'd be like, oh, well, you know, I'm doing X, Y, Z. And I got sick of sort of mumbling a response to that. And that 2018, 2019 was, I saw a friend of mine that I hadn't seen in a couple of years, and they did exactly that. They said, how's the writing going? And I was like, oh, yeah, it's not great. And I wanted to be able to say something different, and, you know, and just to say, I gave it a go. It did work. It didn't work. And I think that, like, that motivation to fulfill the thing that I've been working towards for a long time was what kind of carried me through the querying process and everything else.
You know, it's really interesting, because this morning, before we met, I was listening to a podcast. Well, I had not a podcast, I had a YouTube video going on in the background, and I can't remember who it was now. The guy was basically saying that the way you succeed is you need to work in silence, and that when you tell everyone, oh, I'm going to be writing a book, and he actually used the example, you know, you tell everyone, you listen, I'm going to be writing a book, and then you never actually write the book because you spend so much energy saying I'm going to write the book, you don't actually put that energy into writing the book. So you just have to basically remain quiet about what you're doing, and then all of a sudden, ta-da! Here's
definitely.
my book. But I understand what he was saying.
Yeah, I definitely empathize with the experience of looking for like a shortcut, looking for a thing that would just unlock it all for me and give me the motivation that I needed and give me the kind of the knowledge that I needed. So I did a lot of that, a lot of procrastination, reading other people's books about how they wrote their books, that sort of thing. And I think ultimately that there isn't really a shortcut. If you want to write 100,000 words, you need to start typing. And I think kind of coming to peace with that and saying, I do need to sit down and actually do this, and I need to figure out how to do it sustainably in a way that doesn't kind of wreck my mental health or make me deeply unhappy. You know, how do I do this in a repeatable way that I can then build a career on and interact? Because publishing, you know, it takes what it takes, and it's quite a structured process with it's quite deterministic, because if you think about it, publishing is all about moving large amounts of paper around, really, and it's all about pallets and warehouses and covers and printing presses and some big, you know, and ultimately the printing presses and the pallets don't really care about your feelings or how you're doing. So if you're going to engage with that ecosystem, you need to kind of go in with a good idea of how you're going to manage your time and your moods and everything else. And it really was in the last 3 or 4 years that I've sort of figured that out. I think, you know, the second book and so on is always going to be a bit more of a challenge than the first, but it's been an amazing sort of 2 or 3 years, definitely.
Because this is the thing, you know, when you talk about persistence, and yes, persistence is all well and good, and, you know, we need to be persistent, we need to be consistent. But I don't think people talk enough about how exhausting persistence is and what a mental drain it is, especially when you can't, you know, especially I say no one's asking for the book at a point, unless you're in a contract. You're writing in the hope of something that will happen, and you're like, I need to be persistent. But it can be mentally draining because you don't know what's going to happen at the end.
Absolutely not. And I think even when you're published and you're under contract, you still get those, you know, if you want to try a different genre or you want to write a standalone that nobody's asked for, you still sometimes have that thing where you're writing a book that, you know, is just yours. And that can be quite freeing sometimes, because it means you're not on a timeline, but also you're not on a timeline. So you might end up sort of fiddling with it for a year or 2 years instead of just getting it done and getting it out there. But it's, if you don't kind of think a bit about how you're going to structure that, then you end up, I think, just getting buffeted around by the forces of publishing and your agent and your editor, who are all trying to do good things and do right by you as an author, hopefully. But equally, you know, you end up kind of a hostage to fortune. So what I try to do is to come into it with a bit of a plan and then think consciously about how I'm structuring my work.
I was thinking, you know, I was talking about timing, and, you know, if you could be working on different things that you may not necessarily be contracted for. And I'm working on something, and then I was going over like the previous pages, and then I suddenly noticed the date from an event that happened in the book was 2022. And I had to sit back and say to myself, I have not seriously been working on this thing since 2022. And then obviously common sense dictates that, well, you know, within that time, you would have written 3 other books. So not including the Jigsaw Man. So you've written 3 other books in your series. So there's a reason why, you know, 2022 is the start date. But it is a crazy thing if you haven't got, you know, if someone's not demanding something of you, you can see how it can take a while for you to get to the end.
Yeah, it really can. I've got, so the book that I got representation with is not a Reluctant Spy.
No?
No. So I wrote a science fiction, like an like climate thriller, essentially. It's kind of a near future, semi-post-apocalyptic story called The Burning Line. And that was the book that I taught myself to edit with. And that book, the very first draft of it, I wrote in 2014. So it's over 10 years ago. And it sat on my hard drive for 4 or 5 years, didn't do anything with it. And then I started to look at it in 2020, because in 2019 I wrote another book which was called Shards of Starlight, which is another big science fiction book. And that was an experiment for me in outlining and doing a really, really detailed outline. But the problem was that the final draft was 186,000 words. It was just way too long. And I kind of looked
like
at
3 books.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's far too long. And I looked at that book and I said, I have absolutely no idea how to fix that book. So I'm going to pick one that's shorter. And I'm going to try and edit it down. So I looked at this book, The Burning Line, and I said, I think this is quite commercial. I think it's got potential. So that's the one I used to practice editing, and then ended up submitting, and Harry signed me for it. But it was this kind of classic thing where it's kind of a thriller, but it's also kind of sci-fi. And we submitted it to thriller publishers, and we submitted it to science fiction publishers, and both sides of that equation said it's not quite right for us. It just fell right in the middle between those two genres, which was kind of the point, but nobody decided to take it on, which was a shame. So I wrote, Harry said, can you write just a straight spy thriller, just a straight one? And I started writing a book called The Disaster Club, which is also not this book. And that was 2022, 23. That went out on submission, and it went just to Thriller imprints. And then Toby Jones at Headline, who's my editor now, got back in touch and said, so you can obviously write quickly. You've sent me 2 books in the space of less than 2 years. They're both very good. I can't buy either of them. Do you have any other ideas? And I sort of went, whoa, and freaked out a bit. And Harry said, like, let's have a chat about it. And we wrote up some pitches. We sent them over. And then he asked for a sample for one of them, which was A Reluctant Spy. It was called Legends when I first started drafting it.
Yeah.
The name came later. And I wrote a sample. We sent it off, and they bought it on the sample. So I sold my debut on a proposal, even though it was actually the 3rd book that I'd written with Harry, my agent. So quite unusual.
Well, I have so many questions about that. But first one that popped in, that was in my head with Toby, when he said, you can obviously you can write well, but also you can write quickly. Did he explain to you why he wouldn't take those 2 books on?
Yeah, so I have the rejection emails to go by, and the first one at The Burning Line, it was basically it's too sci-fi for us as an imprint.
Yeah.
The second one, he was like, this is a great book, but it was a contemporary spy thriller, but it had a kind of techie, techno thrillery type twist.
Yeah.
And he said that's not kind of a good fit. Like, it's a great book, really enjoyed it, but that vibe is just not quite right for the list that we currently have. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the time, the big unacknowledged thing is that you come in and you think, oh, well, I've got an agent now. That's hard part's over and done with. 100% not. Like, the hard part comes when you're trying to compete with other fantastic books, all of which have already got over that first hurdle of finding an agent. But you're competing for a very limited number of physical slots to actually produce those books. And as a result, you could have an amazing book, but if there's another book that's very similar, or they already produced one that last year and they don't want to do another book of that kind, or there's just one other that's just a slightly better match, you're out of luck. It's nothing really to do with the individual quality of your book. Yeah. It's just the market that you're in. So it was quite interesting. I was really excited because and Toby said this to me at the time, he says, I really want to work with you rather than buying a particular book from you. Please validate my belief by giving me some good ideas. And I said, I hope some good ideas. And he said, let's try that one. But it was really weird because I ended up in this situation of writing my first ever debut novel, effectively from scratch in the space of about 6 months, without the time that most debuts have to spend, 2 or 3 years thinking about it and putting it together. So yeah, it was a pretty wild experience.
Listening to you, I feel like my head's in the tumble dryer because it's just Like and also thinking rejection is such a strange thing, because I think, when most people think about rejection, they see it in terms, it's a straight line. You offer something, or you ask someone out, and they say no, and then that's the end of it. Like, you go back, you go back to the start. But your rejection was like, I'm offering you something, we like it, but we don't like it. Go back and do something else. So you're still in this very strange relationship. You have to keep, you keep offering something until you can offer something. Here's a pie. Can you make a better pie? Can you put apples in it? Can you put cinnamon in it?
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, I've because I've made a lot of friends in the writing arena since getting an agent. I've met various people through my agent and through different writing communities that I'm in. I've definitely seen a huge range of people's experiences with their second book, because that's the one where they are, if they've got a 2-book contract, they're pitching ideas, and for the first time they're doing it in collaboration with an editor.
Yeah.
Or if they're a 1-book deal, they're having to pitch an option book, and they're trying to come up with something that might get another deal. And a lot of them have really struggled with that, and they've struggled with writing the book. And I struggled with it a bit as well, but I've kind of, my first book was my second book in that sense, because the first book that I actually wanted to get published just didn't find a home. And I think that is also way more common than people let on. I think it happens constantly, and it's horrible. But if you do want to interact with trade publishing, you kind of need to get used to the idea that a lot of very good books just don't make it. And kind of be slightly unsentimental about that fact, I think. But it's a difficult adjustment to make, definitely.
What do you think it is about your psyche that's made you be able to come speak? So I was saying, what is it about your psyche that enables you to handle it? Because it's a completely different sort of pressure than what most people are used to. And a lot of people, they can't separate themselves, their personal selves, from the professional self. And so that rejection, you can't help it, you're taking it on personally. A lot of people just say, well, I'm giving up. Like, I've given you 3 books. What more do you want from me?
and I do not blame them at all. Like, I think I'm quite stubborn. As a general rule, I don't like hearing no. So I tend to push and push and push. I think that I also, I kind of had a word with myself early on when I was transitioning out of this, working long hours in my day job and saying, I want to give writing a proper go. I kind of had this chat with myself, because I live in the country and I live near a beach and some woodland, and I go to the woods and I go down to the water most mornings. So I have a lot of long walks and a lot of thinking time. And I remember quite vividly having several walks where I was thinking, like, if you try to do this and you don't get anywhere, does that mean you're going to give up? Are you going to stop writing? And I was like, well, no, because I think for me, writing is not, or it has to not be about the extrinsic stuff that I can't control, the, awards and getting picked for Waterstones and all the stuff that's out of my control. I can't control any of that. I can't control whether I get published, can't control whether I find an agent. None of that's in my control. I can only control the work itself, how much I produce and how good what I produce is. And I think that I was like, do I enjoy that bit? Do I enjoy the writing bit? And I'm like, yes, I do. Are you going to do it anyway, even if it never comes to anything? Because at the time I was working this agency job and the money wasn't all that great. And I could have been doing freelance work. There's a bunch of other stuff I could have done with my time that probably would have been a better economical use of my time. But I was like, I would probably be very unhappy if I did that. And that's the thing, is I tried to give up writing 2 or 3 times in my mid to late 20s because it felt like it was only bringing me sort of angst. And then I sort of thought about it and said, no, I'm always happier when I'm writing. So I need to figure out how to do that regularly enough that I can do it all the time, and then disentangle it from publishing as an entity and kind of try and keep the two quite compartmentalized. And I would definitely recommend, if you are a younger writer or somebody who's interacting with publishing for the first time, do that thinking, like sit down, write it out, think about who you are and what you want and why you want it, and try and disentangle goals that you can actually affect from dreams that you know that might happen and might not happen. Because if you can focus on specific goals, I think you'll be a lot happier than if you focus on the dreams, and then if the dreams don't come true, you're going to be devastated, obviously. And that, I think a lot of people tangle those two things up.
I always say as well, you know, you can't look at what everyone else is doing. You can be inspired by people, which I think is completely different. So I can be inspired by you and seeing what you've done. I can be inspired by, you said we mentioned Tom Hindle, who I spoke to the other day, you know, and be inspired by the fact that he got Waterstone's book of the month twice.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how on earth does that happen? So you can be inspired by people. But I think if you go into it looking to replicate what they've done and saying, like, I must have that, you'll be unhappy, because it's hard. You just have to focus on what you can do. Because even I remember, I've said it with the Jigsaw Man, when I wrote the book, because I'd self-published before, I already had this option in my head, which was, well, if I don't get an agent and it doesn't means I don't get a traditional publisher, I'll just publish it myself. Yeah. It doesn't, and I won't stop writing. I just knew there was another option for me. And I think sometimes you have to be quite clinical about it and take the emotion away from it. And
I think as well, the thing that's always given me a lot of solace is the sense that no book is ever really truly dead. You know, even if nobody buys it, even if it just goes back into your drawer, you can revisit it in the future. You can self-publish it if you want. You can use it as a calling card, and it might end up getting you know, a phone call from an editor later on, like it did with me. So the work is always there. The work that you've done doesn't just evaporate as soon as you stop doing it. You know, it's behind you, but it can form this sort of well of resources and ideas that you can always call on. And I think if you start thinking of it that way, instead of being like, oh, well, I've wasted my time on this book, nobody's bought it, I can't believe I spent a year writing this thing. And, you know, and I see that all the time. People say stuff like that online or in the pub when we're chatting. They're like, oh, I can't, you know, it was a waste of time. I was like, no, it wasn't, because you learned a ton writing that book, and you have a finished book. And maybe 5 years from now, you can pull that book out of your back pocket and say to an editor, do you want my zombie romance now? You know, because you know, there's books will always have a long-term shelf life beyond just the immediate first time that you try to get them out in the world.
I mean, I'm laughing about the zombie romance. I'm sure there's a film about a zombie romance, and I know there is, because there's several. Yeah. So that was one reason why I was laughing. Listeners, it's time for a very short break. If you're enjoying this conversation with Nadine Matheson and want to help keep the podcast going, why not buy me a cup of coffee? Your support goes such a long way in keeping these conversations flowing. Just check out the link in the show notes. But also, it's so true what you say about having that book in your back pocket, because before Christmas, so I'd finished editing Henley Book 4, and that was literally, a week before Christmas, I'd finished that. And I'm then in my zone of, I'm free as a bird, I have nothing to do. And I'm reading stuff. And then I was going through my computer and I was going through these old files. And then I found a book that I'd written in when did I write it? I got to think when I did the course. I started the course in 2016. So I wrote it and finished it in 2015. And my plan was to edit it and then I'll just self-publish it. But then I did the course and Jigsaw Man happened. So it just kind of just got left away in the hard drive. And then I found it. So I've written this book, 10 years ago. And I mean, it's completely different to what I write now. But I read it and I was like, actually there's something in. Yeah, and I'm like, there's something in here. There's something in here. So I'm like, I'm going to resurrect it in the summer. I mean, my agent might be surprised when I give it to him. It's like, this is so not what you write. But you said, I don't think anything really, it doesn't go to waste at all. And anything you do is not just because, you know, you don't get the agent you want, or you don't get the publication deal you want, or you have self-published and self-publishing hasn't bought you in a penny. it doesn't mean it's gone to waste, because you have actually learned something from that process.
100%. And the work that you did 5 or 10 years ago is rarely as bad as you think it is, but also the work you're doing right now is rarely as good as you hope it is. So it's kind of you're constantly evolving, and you can always learn lessons, I think, by looking backwards as well as forwards. Definitely.
But was there ever a moment when Toby suggesting to you, well, what about a straight down the line spy thriller? Did you not ever say to yourself, really? Is this what I should be doing? And can I do this? Or were you just like, this is business, let me just see what happens?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, is it's actually worked out very well for me, because I've always had two big kind of genre fascinations. One is science fiction. You can probably see the shelves behind me are full of science fiction novels. One is science fiction, which I've always been into. I've always wanted to write it. I have written it since I was quite young. The other is spy fiction. So I did my dissertation at university on John le Carré and Graham Greene. My professor, who's named in the acknowledgements for the book, was one of the first people to say to me, you seem to really enjoy this genre. You should maybe think about writing one. He got a name check for that. I sent him a copy, actually. It was lovely. And he wrote me this beautiful handwritten letter back saying, thank you so much for sending these to Oxford. And yeah, it was really nice. So spy fiction has always been there. I think when people force me to choose, I always kind of say, well, purely by volume alone, I've probably read and written far more science fiction than spy novels. But I hope to do both. And the other thing you might notice behind me is this, half a yard of Ian M. Banks.
Yes.
And Ian Banks had this very, very structured career where he wrote contemporary fiction as Ian Banks and science fiction as Ian M. Banks. And he convinced two different publishers to let him do that. And he basically just alternated them. And I've said every chance I can, when I'm talking to my agent, when I'm talking to my editor, when I'm talking on podcasts, I've said I want to do exactly the same thing, right down to using a middle initial, because to me, that's the ideal, because I write quite fast. And I ideally want to write 2 books, alternate, like one book one year, one book the other year. Now, whether I can get that to line up in a nice way that means I don't have any horrible publishing or scheduling clashes, that remains to be seen. But that is currently the plan. That's what I'm doing. Is I'm writing the second book in this series at the moment, and I'm also in the middle of final edits on a science fiction novel. So it's kind of, hopefully I'll hop between the two. So I haven't had to choose. It's not like a commercial decision where I've said I'm only going to write the one that will make me money. I haven't made that decision. I'm instead just doing both, and that's my happy place. That's where I want to be.
It's good though, isn't it, that you have that happy place, and these are your two genres these are the genres you actually want to write in, as opposed to, as in a lot of people, they feel like they have to write to trend, and they're not being authentic to themselves, because it's going against the grain. It's going against what you enjoy.
Yeah, and I think if you're attempting to write to trend, it's a little bit like timing the stock market. It's probably a bad idea, because you're at least 2 years behind that trend. The books that are coming out today are what people were buying editorially 2 years ago. So if you're just sitting down to write a woman on a train in a window domestic thriller, that had its moment 5 or 6 years ago. It might come back again, and if you've got one ready to go, awesome. But I think that kind of slightly cynical timing of the market is not necessarily all that sensible of a strategy. I think what you can do is write the book that you want you want to write, but have an eye on the market when you're doing it. So think about, is this viable? Does this feel like does it have a hook that I can explain in a single sentence? Can I convincingly get across what this book is about to my editor? And all those commercial considerations are going to come into play when you have those conversations. And you can't avoid them once you're in the ecosystem and you're talking to people. They're like, how am I going to pitch this to sales? How am I going to pitch this to the booksellers? And you have to kind of figure that out, I think.
Yeah, because I remember I don't keep going back to the Jigsaw Man, but when I wrote it, when I came up with the idea to write it, I was looking at the market because obviously you look, and I was doing the course, so you're looking at what is number one, what is popular, and at the time, it's the girl on everything. It was psychological thrillers everywhere, and I just remember looking, thinking, well, yeah, there's psychological thrillers everywhere and domestic thrillers, but there's no one's writing about serial killers anymore. It's like the serial killers had disappeared. I thought, I'm going to bring the serial killers back. And then by the time I wrote the book, and then the time the book came out, a lot of people must have had the same idea, because then there was a load of serial killer books that came out in, what year was it, 2021. So you can't predict it. I thought it was just going to be, it'd be me alone bringing it back.
I think there's actually a name for that. Like, it's because it happens in Hollywood quite a lot. Like, you'll get two completely unrelated volcano films or two completely unrelated asteroid films. It happened, I think, 3 or 4 times in the 90s.
Happened loads of times. Armageddon and The Call, Deep Impact. You like Pierce Brosnan's one with the volcano? I can't remember what that one's called. But anyway.
But yeah, I think it is literally just called Volcano. Oh no, Dante's Peak is the one.
Yeah, that's it. Dante's Peak.
How do I know that? That's ridiculous.
You're good in a pub quiz.
I store useless information. I think a lot of guys store like football statistics. I store like,
random movie stuff,
filmography, and things like that. But I think I do have a question for you, actually. I'm very curious because I've met a lot of lawyers who are also authors.
Yes.
What do you think it is about lawyers that makes them good at or attracted to the world of publishing?
I've asked this question of other lawyers who I've spoken to on the podcast.
I want to hear your answer.
The only thing I can put it down to is that I hear so many stories and that is what you are. That is what they are. When I'm given a case, it is literally a story. Something happened at the beginning, middle, and hopefully I'll get to the end of it. And I do remember going through a client's statement, or no, I was drafting their proof of evidence, as we call it, if you're the defense. So it's their statement, their version of events. And I'm going through it and I'm thinking, this is just a story. I don't know if I believe it, but it is a story. And I think that's what you're drawn to. You're drawn to that story, and I think in criminal law, there's so many various twists and turns in that story. There's, a witness can come in at the last minute and completely turn everything on its head. And that's kind of what you want in a thriller. You want that red herring to not to be the thing you thought it was going to be, and then something to come in and take you by surprise. And also, I think, like clients, like you would have heard me, I've done it more than once. I'll say character and I end up saying witness or client, but I meant to say character. But, I always say you can have 10 clients charged with the same offence, but everyone's story is different. And then I think I realised with clients as well, and when I am looking at character, they're not just one dimensional. A villain's not just a villain. There is a backstory to them. Something has made them that way, and then something continues to motivate them. So that's those are my reasons, probably why I'm drawn to writing, and especially criminal.
Do you think the very structured nature of legal training and the quite high pressured nature of the job as well kind of prepares you to do things like writing to deadlines?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think personally, even if I didn't have the legal training, I need someone to say to me, I need it to be done by such and such day. Otherwise, I need a deadline. I can find a million other things to do. I get distracted very, very, very easily. So I need those deadlines. But the legal training, it does a variety of things. So it does here's a deadline you need to write to deadline. If you're writing an application, you're writing a skeleton argument, have you got rid of all the noise, all the stuff that's not relevant, everything that's important? Are you able to put that, just the essential facts, in your document? If you're doing your closing speech, which I always say to the baby lawyers, you're telling them a story. So you need to convince them to arrive at the conclusion you want them to arrive at. You want them to follow you. So I think all of that works when you're writing a book. without it. Yeah. And also I know you're a planner because I read your blog, and I'm a planner, and I need I need that plan. But again, same as when I'm writing a closing speech, I'll always say to the baby lawyers that you don't have to stick rigidly to that speech, because you need to allow for the fact that the prosecutor might have said something 10 minutes before you got on your feet. So you need to be able to have room in there to respond to that. And that's the same way I feel about writing my plan for my books. I have my plan, but I'm not like, I need to stick to every single thing in this plan. I just call it a safety net. So I can go off course and then come back to it if I need to.
And one of the kind of side effects of having sold the book on proposal is that I've had to kind of formalize how I do planning and pitching and writing up proposals, because before that I would write a bullet point outline, and it was very light, and then I went to the other extreme, and I had like a spreadsheet with every scene and every plot beat in it, and that's how I got
spreadsheets scare me.
No, it's terrible. And then what I realized is I had a really nice middle ground where I could produce something that looked a bit like a film treatment. So it's between 3 and 5 pages, or sometimes 8 to 10 pages. And it's essentially just a slightly jazzed up synopsis. So it's got a bit of voice to it. It's not just a dry recounting of what happens, but it is quite high level, and it's functioning at the chapter level rather than scenes and beats. And then when I actually start writing, as I'm writing on a Monday or a Tuesday, I'll sit down and say, what am I writing this week? And I'll look at the high level outline, and then I will do a micro outline for that week. And I'll go through and do plot beats and what does the scene need to do? Who's in the scene? How does it link to previous scenes? How does it link to future scenes? And I do the detail work only when I get to it. And that, I think that helps me to be flexible and adaptive, and have the flexibility to change things a little bit as I go, but without feeling like I don't have a plan at all and I'm just sort of flailing around trying to figure out what's going on. And that works really well for me.
I mean, there are some people who'd be listening to us, and the very idea of, they're saying, talking about beats, micro beats, planning, going back to the planner, be like, well, no, it would just scare them off. But you honestly just have to find the right way that works for you. And you probably won't even realize what works for you until you've actually written your first book.
No. And one of the nice things about becoming published is making connections with other writers, and sitting in Discord servers and various other places, chatting to people in group chats and things. And I have several friends who are discovery writers who tell me, in order to write that book, I had to essentially write it 3 times, and completely broke it down, rebuilt it from scratch. I'm like, that sounds horrendous. That sounds really painful. And I always say to them, I'm like, I'm discovery writing as well. It's just that I do it in bullet points instead of finished books. I'm I'm making it up, but you guys are like writing the whole book to figure out what's going on. And I'm like, that's a lot, man.
No, I found what's happening now though. Obviously, it's like anything. The more you do, you adapt as you go along. So whereas before in the early days, when I made definitely with the first 3 books in the series that I wrote, it was very much, I had the plan. I stuck to the plan, it's flexible, but it was linear from beginning to end. And then I found with the 4th book, and it was a timing thing, because I was doing other things. I was like, I don't have time to get this book done. And then I just adapted it. Whereas I wrote what would I do? I would write the first 2 acts, so act 1, act 2, because that's how I plan. That's how I work.
Yeah.
And whereas before I'd finish it and then go back and do the rewrite. I wrote act 1 and 2, and then when I finished act 2, I then started the rewrite, so I wouldn't do the last third. Because then once I've rewritten it, I know exactly, I've cleared up the mess, because it's the messy first draft. So I don't finish the messy first draft. And it's only with the 4th book, I'm like, and I'm like, I was telling Tariq about it. When was that? When was that a festival? Yeah, I was telling him about it. And he was like, oh, same thing. I said, yeah. And I've worked. I think actually that works for me, because my first draft is always an absolute mess. But if I leave it at the end, before I get to the end and clear it up, I know exactly what I need to do. to finish it.
That's really cool. And the thing is, like, that could work for me. I could try that, and it might work for me. I might even try it on the book I'm writing at the moment. But I think the one thing I've definitely found is that writing processes, they're not static. They change in response to your skills, how much they've changed, new things you've learned how to do, and time pressure, and competing projects. And once you're published, you're doing that kind of merry-go-round where you're promoting one book, you're outlining a second book, you're drafting a third, and you're possibly editing a fourth. That's depending how fast you write. And you can't have a rigid writing process that never changes. You need to kind of roll with the punches a little bit.
Did it surprise you once you got into the publishing process and you found yourself, because when it happened to me, you find yourself in that situation where you're working on, I say, in book 2, book 1's pissed off because of your publisher, your editor, doing whatever, and you're getting into the flow of writing your book, and then the next one, the book that you'd sent off, has come back, and you're like, okay, I need to go back and do the edits or whatever on that. But also, you're supposed to be promoting the book that's currently out at the moment, so you are doing 3 things. Was that a shock? Because it was a shock for me. I didn't like it. It
really was. Yeah, I think what I've said to my family when I'm trying to explain this, and they're asking me what I'm working on and things, I said I used to have 3 jobs. I used to have the job of being just a human, just existing in the world, and keeping the house clean, and seeing my family, and living, doing my day job, making sure that the lights stay on and I do a good job at my day job, and writing was like the third thing. And it was kind of the third thing priority wise, because it was always the thing that would fall by the wayside if the first 2 picked up. But I now have 4 jobs. I have being a human, doing my day job, writing, but publishing is a fourth, and probably sometimes occasionally harder job, where people are relying on me to do things at certain times. They're relying on me to complete things within agreed timelines. So suddenly that has kind of leapfrogged, and writing is dropped into sort of third place sometimes, and then publishing is sort of hopping up and down depending on, it goes silent for months at a time sometimes. But I've definitely found that quite hard. And I think even though I felt like I was really prepared for it, the numbers don't really lie. And when I looked at my word count for last year, I do an end of year's numbers post where I kind of count up what I've done each year, and it was half. My word count had been cut in half, and I was like, goodness me, that I didn't expect it to be that drastic. I thought, oh, maybe it'll be 20,000-30,000 words less than last year, and it wasn't. It was half. I went from 160,000-180,000 words in a year to 80,000.
Oh wow, that is a big cut.
Big cut. And it was largely because I was doing stuff. I felt like I was really busy. I was kind of faffing around with the outline for a science fiction novel that felt like work, but it wasn't really work. It was procrastination. And I don't regret it, because, it was my debut year. It's the first time I'd ever done it. But I definitely, looking back, I'm like, I probably should have just cracked on with a book and just distracted myself by writing another thing. And I didn't really. I finished books, I kind of finished edits, and I did bits and bobs, but I didn't really start a new project, and I kind of wish I had. I'm on one now. I'm started one now. So.
Yeah, I think it takes you about a good 3 books in before you start getting into the rhythm that works for you. Writing. You said writing, publishing, promoting, because they're all completely different things. They're all completely different jobs. I think it takes about 3 years to get into a rhythm that works for you. I had a question for you, and it went out of my head, and I was supposed to write it down, and it's gone. But I'll ask you this question instead. When you were talking before earlier about, telling people you're going to write a book and you haven't written the book, and then you meet your mate in the pub you haven't seen for years, and what's happened to the book? How did they respond when you were like, da-da, I have the reluctant spy?
Exceptionally and exceptionally well. And I think you can probably tell that by the number of people that I thank and the acknowledgements. Yeah. And I think every first time novelist is always gonna, their first acknowledgements page is going to be their longest.
It's so long.
Yeah. Because that is where the bill comes due in terms of all the people that have helped you over the years, and that's your first and best chance to make sure that, because not everyone's going to read every book I write, but most people I know are probably going to at least buy or check out the library in my first book because they're like, oh,
Yeah.
Dave's finally made good on the thing he's been saying he's going to do for years. I'm going to have a look at it. And one of my favorite things to do has been to hand the book to a friend of mine who's in the acknowledgements and watch them when they get to their own name, because it's really, you know, I didn't do this on my own. I did it with the support of my friends and my family and all the people who I worked with over the years who didn't sort of who didn't laugh at me when I said that I was a writer. You know, all those people, even if they weren't actively supporting me, they weren't discouraging me, and that's kind of almost as important sometimes. And I think it's been the amazing thing has been the number of people that I used to work with, you know, 10, 15 years ago in some cases, who have messaged me on LinkedIn of all places saying, oh,
it's always LinkedIn.
It's always LinkedIn.
It's the weird one. It's
I
no
call
use
it boring
for
Facebook.
Yeah, it's no use for anything else, but all of a sudden you'll get people you worked with.
Yeah.
Messaging
I've got I got a message the other day from a guy that I worked with in the Playhouse Theatre in Edinburgh when I was 16, and I've not seen him since. And for whatever reason, it's the only social media network that I'm linked with him on, and he followed me on there years and years ago. He lives down south somewhere now. And he messaged me and said, oh, I picked up your book. It was fantastic. And I'm like, that's awesome. Like, thank you, you know, because, you know, it's only out in hardbacks, coming out in paperback in June. And it's 18 to 22 quid. It's quite a lot of money to spend on some guy you worked with 30 years ago. You know, I'm like, thanks, man. That's so yeah.
That's great.
It is great. It is. And the response has been really amazing and kind of humbling, to be honest.
Yeah. This is the question I was going to ask you, the one that disappeared from my brain. Is there anything in your previous jobs that has, I'd say, made this publishing journey easier?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. So I was an English literature graduate. And we'll maybe talk about this when we talk about the kind of set questions that you have at the end.
Yeah.
But when I came out of university, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I for reasons that I'll tell you in a minute, I didn't go for the thing I thought I was going for. So I was kind of adrift, and I ended up getting a graduate scheme job working in IT consulting, which is kind of quite techy, but I was doing the soft side of it. I was writing communications, so I was having to write, you know, advertising and manuals and all sorts of writing. So I did creative work for a long time, and I got to work with some amazing advertising writers, people who wrote ads, and I got to do lots of different things and work in lots of different industries. So I can fairly convincingly talk about a lot of different industries, which is useful. And I also just learned how to figure out how businesses worked. So when I came into trade publishing, I think I was kind of primed to look at the processes and think about how it all slotted together, and kind of takes a slightly unromantic view of it. Because I think, you know, it's a creative industry, and it's full of people who love books, and it's full of kind of quite introverted, bookish people who love to talk about books. And there's this tendency to treat it all like it's sort of covered in stardust and it's all about dreams and hopes. But it's, as I said before, I think it's it's a logistics business when you get down to it.
Yeah.
And as an author, in the most unromantic way, you are a business to business supplier of a product that they then, you know, send out into the world for you. So I think coming in with that mindset, not like cold hard commercialism, but coming in and thinking, yes, this is a really fun, collaborative, creative thing that I'm doing, but it is a business, and I'm dealing with them as business partners. That helped me, I think, it didn't help me that much because I still had quite a tough first debut year.
Yeah.
It did a number on my productivity, 100%. But I think it did help me to think more and think quite consciously about how I interacted with publishing and with my publisher, my editor, and so on.
But it's like what I've always said more than once on this podcast. There comes a point when you've got to take off the TV glasses version, like, you know, the TV movie version glasses of publishing, which is, you know, your editor sending. What did I watch the other day? She didn't send her off. She sent her off to a castle to edit her book and think about what she wanted to do with her editor.
I think Murder
Which
She
is
Wrote,
just-
she goes on a cruise at
Yeah.
one point. Her publisher sends her on a cruise. Yeah. No,
Because she handed in her draft early. Actually, I'm going to talk to my editor. I'm going to say to her, Manpreet, I gave you my edits a week earlier than I said I would. Where's my cruise? I'm going to WhatsApp her. She'll just laugh
It's
at
interesting
me.
because the other thing that happened around the publication of the book was it got optioned for TV. And my experience of TV was very much that. It was like being wined and dined. It was incredibly exciting Zoom calls, and then complete silence for 6 to 9 months, because that's what somebody once explained it to me. They said everything in publishing is a no until it's a yes. Like it's no, and then you get a yes, and you no, yes. Whereas in film and TV, everything is a yes until it's a no. So people are very excited to meet you. They've got all these ideas. Here's a pitch deck with a load of cool photos. It's super exciting, but then complete silence, and almost nothing actually gets made relative to the number of things that get optioned. And I was really glad somebody said that to me, because I mean, my head was spinning anyway, just with the number of meetings we had and the number of people we spoke to. But it was good to kind of keep me grounded.
Keep you level, keep you grounded, yeah.
Because otherwise I'd be sitting there like Jessica from Murder, She Wrote, demanding my cruise and saying, come on, let's get going.
But there's a reason why they call it development hell, because it really is development hell. Because even with Jigsaw Man, I remember getting to the point where you said everything's a yes. It's a yes. Yeah. We got these screenwriters we've got on board. We got this director we have on board, and this is what we'll do with it. So you're having all those meetings, having all those discussions. I was having phone calls with the person who's going to be adapting the book and talking about character, doing all these things. And then it's like, you've had all these dates, you've been romanced to the hill. You literally think, well, I'm going to get the ring now. And then they just ghost you.
And the thing is, it might happen. It might still happen. Like, they might come out of nowhere a year later and say, okay, we've got a green light. And you're like, oh, brilliant. But, you just need to get used to that weird, like really intense love bombing at the start. And I'm Scottish, and as a general rule, we don't do very well with like receiving compliments straight to our faces. So I was sitting on these calls just like I don't know how to respond to people being this nice to me in a sustained way for like an hour. It was intense, but it was amazing. It's one of the weirdest 2 months of my life, but it was, I think, to be honest, that was a large part of why my productivity collapsed, because that just set me spinning.
Blew your mind.
Yeah, it just really did.
The only reason I'm laughing so much, because I just feel like it's just going to be like an EastEnders episode. You've been love bombed, and then he's disappeared, and then no one's seen him for years, and they think he's dead. Well, there was a funeral. You're sure he's dead, and then up he pops.
He just walks in the door of the Queen Vic. Like, hello, Paula. I don't watch EastEnders. I don't know any characters.
That's basically it. That's basically it. You've summed up EastEnders. So right, before we go on to... It goes off. I told you it goes off in a tangent. Anyway, before we go on to the last set of questions, Dave, would you like to tell listeners of the conversation about A Reluctant Spy, and then what's happening next for you?
We should probably talk about the actual book.
We should. So, I think it might be a good thing.
So, A Reluctant Spy is about a young man called Jamie Tulloch. He is a Scot from the west of Edinburgh. I'm a Scot from the west of Edinburgh, but I'm not.
You're not Jamie.
No, I'm not Jamie. And he's a young guy from a slightly sketchy housing estate on the edge of Edinburgh, and he gets to Cambridge on his own, essentially on a scholarship. And when he's at Cambridge, he's very aware that he's not like a lot of the other people who are at Cambridge University. And then he gets approached by an MI6 program called the Legends program, who say, we will give you the safety net that you do not currently have. So we will essentially pay off your student loans. We'll make you find a job after university. We'll help you, build your career. we'll give you all the things that your middle and upper class colleagues all have already because of where they were born and the people they know. We'll give you that. We'll give you that support. And in return, we'll come back 5 to 10 years from now and we'll ask you to just go on a quick holiday while we use your identity for something. And we won't tell you what it is, but you'll come back from your holiday. Nobody will be any the wiser. We'll have done what we need to do. And it came from this idea that faking an identity in the digital age is incredibly hard to do. So what if we had people who would just loan their identities to covert agents? So he says, oh, yeah, I think I can do that. And he agrees to do that. And when the book starts, he's living his new life and he's kind of unhappy because his life feels quite limited. He's not allowed to have that many friends. He's not allowed to have photos of himself online. He just needs to basically exist in the world and create that digital trail that convinces people that he's a real person, because he is a real person. But then he gets activated and he gets told to go to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris and meet his handler, and then he'll swap with his opposite number, who's this doppelganger, a guy that looks like him who's going to step into his life. And he does that. And when he gets to Charles de Gaulle Airport, things go badly wrong in Charles de Gaulle Airport. And then he ends up, through various twists and turns, on the mission himself, playing himself. And he's dealing with Russian arms dealers and all sorts of stuff. And the second half of the novel is set on Zanzibar in the resort of a Russian oligarch. And simultaneously, there's shenanigans going on in London. But that's the basic pitch: is that an accidental spy, a reluctant spy, who ends up on a mission that he was never supposed to be anywhere near.
Were you thinking of movies, like having it as adapted into a film? Because when you read the opening, it feels like, it reminds me of Mission Impossible 3, when you have the whole "where is the rabbit's foot?" and then it goes back.
I think I'd be lying if I didn't say that spy films are a definite influence. I love the Bourne movies, for example. I think they're fantastic. And I wanted something that trod that line between cinematic, explosive, things exploding in helicopters and so on, and the more sort of slow-moving, John le Carré-esque, everyone, some people's got ketchup stains on their ties and they're, just gradually losing the will to live. I wanted somewhere in the middle between those. And I think McHerron writes books like that, where there is action, but there's also that gritty, realistic feel. And I wanted mine to be in that same ballpark, definitely. But I write cinematically because I think visually.
In scenes.
I think in scenes, I think in camera angles. But I also try to balance that out with internality and have characters thinking on the page, and so it's not just pure surface and just reading like a script, essentially.
I see the scenes first. When I'm coming up with the idea, it's with the binding room. I saw not the opening scene. I saw like the next scene when they discover the young man tied to the bed and they think he's dead. I saw that scene first and I was like, okay, now I need to, now I'm building around that. So what's after A Reluctant Spy?
So I'm doing edits at the moment on, my agent literally came back last night with edits on the science fiction novel, and I'm drafting a second novel, which I can't tell you about, but it's another spy novel.
I like that.
And
that's such a spy thing to say, Dave. I'm drafting a spy novel, but I can't tell you about the spy novel.
Hopefully I'll be able to talk to people about it fairly soon. But the plan is to get another spy novel done, get another science fiction novel out on submission, and then after that I'm not sure. But I write pretty quickly and I get bored quite easily, so I will, if we talk again in a year's time, I'll probably be on something completely different.
Well, before I ask you your first question, what's your response to when your edits land in your inbox?
Well, I actually wrote quite a long blog post about this because I think...
Oh, you did?
It's called How I Deal with Edit Letters. And weirdly, that blog post ended up having like a weird second life among PhD candidates. It got forwarded around by a bunch of people doing their PhDs because in the PhD world, you get effectively edit letters from your PhD markers that you then have to, and a lot of PhDs struggle with that aspect of the process. So it got sent around a load of like academic blogs and stuff. But what I do, I read it, I just read it quickly just to get a sense of it, and then I don't touch it for 24 to 48 hours because I need to go away and just, have a sulk essentially, because I'm like, oh, you're completely wrong. And I know I have that reaction, and I don't want to start working on it while I'm still having that reaction, because I'll probably end up discounting really good feedback if I do that. So I go away, I have a sulk, then I read it in detail, and I break it down and rewrite it in my own words. And I usually at that stage, I'm also combining it with beta reader feedback from my critique partners. So I will write down literally, let's say I want to improve the foreshadowing of Big Johnny's relationship with his mother. I'll say, Big Johnny mother relationship foreshadowing, that's the task. And then I'll say on page X, I'm going to do it here, I'm going to do it here, 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 and here. And I'll break it down so that I can just check those off as I go through. And that's structuring, that kind of turning it into a series of bite-sized chunks of work that I can check off, is the difference between me staring at an edit letter and having an existential crisis because of the scope and the scale of the work, and me going, okay, today I'm going to try and do these two things. So that, I have to break it down, because otherwise I would just, I would have a breakdown if I didn't break it down.
It was similar in the sense that I get the email and I'm like, already? That's what happened. I was like, already? Okay. And then
I fast when you don't want them to be fast, aren't they?
I know. When you're like, it's back. So I get the email, and it's like, here's your, like, thank you so much. Love. All I need to see is like, we love the book. I'm like, good. You love the book. And it's like, well, here's my edit letter, and then here's the comments. And this is what I do. Thank you so much. I'll let you know by the end of the week when I will be getting back to you with delivery thing. Yeah, and then I don't read the actual letter for about 2 days, because it's like I'm mentally preparing myself. It's like I need to prepare myself to read it, and then I read it, and then I sulk, and then so it's like a week.
So you add an extra 2 days before that. I read it straight off because I do want to make sure there's nothing too scary in there. But yeah, I might do that. I might just add an extra couple of days.
I have a buffer zone. But there's still sulking involved. Like, what? Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I am very lucky so far. My edit letters have been relatively structurally light, and I think that is because I'm part of a very in-depth critique group. So by the time a book that I've written gets to an editor, it's been through a draft, an edit that I do on my own, then an edit with my critique partners, and usually another full edit that I do on my own again. So it's been through 2 or 3 revisions at that point already, and it's usually fairly structurally sound. But
I think even if you don't have like a critique group or beta readers, by the time you're probably like on your third or 4th book, by the time you get your 3rd or 4th edit letter, you'll find that your editing is actually lighter, because you may not be going through with a red pen editing, but you are actually thinking more in terms of in editor mode when you're writing, as opposed to in the very beginning. Right. So Dave, because we're talking and talking and talking, but are you I know we have, are you an introvert or extrovert, or a hybrid of the two?
I am a situational extrovert who is introverted by inclination. So I'm definitely if I have a choice, I will always want to. And I was nodding along when I listened to Tom Hindle's answer to this question, because I'm pretty much identical. I can stand up, I can do something like this, and I can chat away to somebody I've not met before and be very animated. But I'll probably need to not speak to anyone for 6 to 10 hours after this. And I think one of the things I was thinking is introverted folks and writers, I think, quite often end up with similarly introverted partners, because for me, like my wife Valerie is the only person who I don't find draining to be around all the time. Even friends and family, I go out, I'll meet them, I'll be extroverted, I'll chat away to them, but then I need to come home, and my wife is the one person that I don't feel that need, just spending time with her feels really good. So I think I definitely found last year, because I did Harrogate and I did Bloody Scotland and I did a whole bunch of other little smaller conventions, and I found that I was just wiped out at the end of the year by that kind of being on in public and talking to people, and that was before the book came out, so I have no idea what it'll be like this year, because presumably people will be like, oh, hello, I read your book, and I'll be like, oh, it's going to be a lot. But definitely introvert who can play act at being an extrovert.
Yeah, your Harrogate experience, there's like two versions of you. There's going to be the I've got a book at Harrogate, and then the next one, you'll see the difference. You're like, oh, this is what it's like now, because now you're that David Goodman. That's what's going to happen. Yeah, I had one or two of those, like, people. There was a bookseller who approached me, a lovely guy who works in Wimbledon, Waterstones, called Andreas, who's like, I know Andreas. You met Andreas, yeah. And he's one of the nicest guys, and he was the first person to walk up to me at a festival and say, "Are you David Goodman?" And I was like, "I've been waiting for somebody to do that my whole life. This is amazing." So he was he was just so encouraging, and that was the first day when I'd arrived, and it was Yorkshire, and it was like 35 degrees Celsius, and I was standing there in a flannel shirt, like just melting. And he walked up and he was like, "Are you David Goodman?" And I was like, "Oh, brilliant! You've made it worth it." Those are good moments. That is a good moment. Okay, so what challenge or experience in your life shaped you the most?
Well, I alluded to it earlier. I think so when I was 21, 22, I was at university, and I joined the Officer Training Corps, which is at the time, Territorial Army unit that's attached to the university. And for a long time, pretty much the whole way through university, I was like, that's what I'm going to do after university. I'm going to join the army and just, get some experience in the world, go and do some stuff. Obviously, this was right before 9/11 and Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of my friends joined the army and then immediately went on back-to-back tours in active conflict zones for several years. However, I went to Sandhurst. I went to the RCB, which is the Regular Commissions Board, and I went through that, and I got a Category 1, which is basically you're good to go. But then in the medical assessment at the time, I had quite bad eczema, and because it's hereditary, and eczema at the time was a bar to regular service.
Really?
Yeah.
I have eczema, so I'm like, but at the time, really?
Yeah, and it's kind of a Cold War hangover, because they thought that most British Army soldiers would at some point have to put on an NBC suit and sit in a trench and wait for the Soviets to come across the border at them. And they believed at the time that if you had any sort of skin condition, you couldn't do that. You couldn't sit in an NBC suit in a trench. So they basically said, nope, sorry, not going to happen. And it was the first time, I think, in my life, because I'd always been brought up to be like, you can do anything you want to do. You can, go and figure out what you want to do with your life. That was the very first time I'd had a door like closed in my face. And as a result, I just really didn't know what I was going to do with myself. I hadn't done any sort of internships. I hadn't done any thinking about any alternatives, and a lot of my friends were becoming teachers, and other people were going into publishing or into sort of magazines and newspapers before those started to collapse, and I was just sort of making coffees at Starbucks and not really knowing what to do with my life. But because I didn't go into the army, the whole course of my life completely changed, and it was very much this kind of key divergence point, and everything else that's flowed from that, the graduate job that I got in London, the work that I did in advertising, moving back to Scotland after being in London for 6 years, all of that happened because I didn't go into the army. And I think if I had gone into the army, I'd probably be quite a different person in a lot of different ways, just because it's the army is not just a job, it's very much a lifestyle and a social culture. And my friends who went into the army have kind of always looked at me and said, you probably wouldn't have liked it all that much. I think, you enjoyed playing at soldiers when you were in the Territorial Army and going away at the weekends and doing the kind of weekend warrior thing, but you probably wouldn't have interacted well with the army at an institutional level. But what it did give me was a bunch of knowledge and contacts and things that have become useful in writing the fiction, and I'm able to play on that and to write reasonably realistic stuff. And Mike Craven, who blurbed The Reluctant Spy, he was in the army for I think 12 or 15 years, and he got back in touch with me, and I said, was there anything in there that wasn't realistic from a military point of view. And he went, no, oh yeah, I think you nailed it, and I'm like, cool, good, phew, because I very much was an amateur part-time soldier for 2 or 3 years, and but it was enough to give it a flavour of realism.
But who would have thought X-Men would be like your sliding doors moment?
Yeah, I know. X-Men's
it's just annoying to me. I have it, and it's an annoyance, but it hasn't been a sliding door moment for me.
And it is weird. I do think about it because it's probably something that if I had realized, I probably wouldn't have disclosed. I probably would have said, oh no, I wouldn't have put it on the form. And I did. And not realizing that it was going to be a bar to service. They took me down, they sent me down to Aldershot. The Army's dermatologist examined me because the Army apparently has a dermatologist, like a dedicated dermatologist. And she's like, I'm really sorry, it's not going to happen. And it was intense. And I went through a lot of different careers and did a lot of long hours and learned a lot of things as a result. But what I didn't do was the thing I thought I was going to do, which was to be a soldier.
It's crazy because, the only time I ever think about people getting disbarred from the army or not being eligible for service is when, I'm not mentioning his name because I don't like him, the current president, the new president, and he didn't go to Vietnam because of bone spurs. So that's what you're thinking about, which didn't exist. But anyway, it's another story for another day. But you're thinking if there's a bar to the army, it's going to be something big.
Yes. Not just like slightly itchy skin. Yeah.
You got a bit of an itchy skin. Oh my God. You need a prescription for it. All right. So if you could go back to when you were 25 years old and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
So I was listening to Tom's interview when he was talking about this. And for him, 25 was like 6 years in the past. For me, 25 is longer than that. And I was trying to think back to what my life was like when I was 25. And at the time I was working in marketing. I was working long hours. I just got married. We still lived in London. We were thinking about moving back. I think if I could tell that guy anything, it would be to worry a bit less about making the wrong choices, especially when it comes to the writing, because I think I spun my wheels for a long, long, long time, worrying that my ideas weren't good enough, or that, worrying about the opportunity cost of making any particular decision or deciding to write any particular book. And the thing is, like, life is long and you've got quite a lot of, it's the longest thing there is, as Billy Connolly used to say. And I think that you can waste way more time worrying about whether you're making the right choice than if you just made a choice and then lived with the results. Yeah. And I think I'd love to say to that guy, stop sitting there writing out lists of ideas and then worrying that none of them are good enough, and just pick one and start working on it. And maybe as well, like, go and get an in-house job and stop working for marketing agencies earlier, because it'll make you happier, you'll get paid more, and you'll have more energy to do the stuff you actually want to do. But he'd probably ignore me because he was having a great time. He was working in an office with a pool table and a beer fridge and all that sort of stuff.
He's having a great time. Right, I've got one extra question now before I do the last final one. What is your one writing tip for writers?
My one writing tip is, that's a good question. I think it is to focus on whatever makes writing sustainable for you. Because the answer to that is going to be different for everybody. There's no one thing you can do or routine that you can do that will work for everybody. But if you, it's not really about how many hours a day you write or how many words per day you write. It's about how many days in a row, or not necessarily even in a row, but how many days you can stack up in aggregate. And whatever makes it possible for you to run that marathon over a long time is going to stand you in good stead for both dealing with publishing, because you need that steady production pace in order to deal with publishing. But it's also going to just mean that you will do, I think, better work, because you will be rested and happy, and you won't be emotionally turbulent when you're trying to do your creative work.
That's a good one. Okay. And finally, where can listeners of the conversation find you online?
The quickest way to find me is on davidgoodman.net, which is my website. I write a near daily blog. It's not daily because I can't write every day, but most weekdays I will be writing. And I am also on Blue Sky. I think I'm Dave Goodman author on there, or possibly just Dave Goodman. I can never remember what I've set up on what service. I'm on Instagram as Dave Goodman author, and I'm on Mastodon if you're into that, if you're a nerdy type. I think I'm on Threads as well, but I'm not vibing with Threads. I don't know.
I see you more on Blue Sky.
Yes, I'm much more on Blue Sky, definitely. Blue Sky is quite a nice place, socially speaking. It's got good tools. Good.
It's a nice space. Well, that just leaves me, David Goodman, to say thank you very much for being part of the conversation.
I've had an amazing time. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening to today's conversation with Nadine Matheson. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a brand new episode featuring more amazing guests. Don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a review. It really helps the podcast grow. And if you'd like to support the show, you can buy me a cup of coffee or sign up on Patreon. The links are in the show notes. And if you'd love to join the conversation as a guest, feel free to send an email to theconversation@nadinematheson.com. Thanks again for your support, and I'll catch you next time.